Hi, you guys. So I am making this video to explain what to do in activity 3.17. The reason I'm making it a video is because you guys are going to be working at it at different paces, and I want you to be able to see it when you're ready, when you're done with your end of the year assessment, and so that you can go back and listen to it if you need to. So I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, and just to remind you guys, this is activity 3.17. This is the outline for your final essay. So it's really important that you do this so that you can be prepared for your essay. And if you do this with a lot of detail and a lot of thought, then your essay is going to be a piece of cake. Some of you guys already turned this in, but you did it before getting my instructions. So I suggest that after listening to this, you guys go back and edit it and then resubmit it. So remember, for your final essay, you have to write about how key coming of age scenes from To Kill a Mockingbird are developed through literary elements. So you're going to be analyzing the book. So we've been practicing analyzing through our text-dependent questions and through your literary analysis note taker, but now you're putting it all together in an essay. So just to remind you guys, when we say literary elements, this is the stuff we're talking about. The words that we use specifically in English class to talk about books and poems and stories. So these are the things we've been talking about this year. Internal and external conflict, irony, point of view, symbol, plot, subplot, character, diction, syntax, imagery. All of these are really, really useful, and you're going to use them for the rest of your life. Every time you take an English class, these are words that you're going to use to analyze literature. So I had suggested that you guys start by putting in your paragraphs that you got from your literary analysis note taker. So this is kind of working backwards. Like, let's say I have a chapter that's about character, like Mrs. DeBoe's character. And then I have a chapter where I was analyzing conflict with Tom Robinson's conflict, where the racist people in Macomb wanted to go lynch Tom Robinson, and Atticus was protecting him. And then I want to talk about character with DILL. Okay, where DILL says that mean thing to Atticus and Scout punches him in the face and she gets in trouble. So I want to talk about those three things. So if I like those paragraphs and those are the ones I put in my body paragraph, then I'm going to have to think backwards and try to figure out, what do these all have in common? How are these three paragraphs all connected? Okay, Mrs. DeBoe, who's racist, DILL, who's mean and racist, and then the Cunninghams who try to kill Tom Robinson because he's Black. Okay, so those three things, they all have conflict because of racism. Okay, so that's something. So then I have to go backwards and explain here how all of these are connected. And this is the hard part, this is a tricky part, how that conflict of racism adds to Jem and Scout's coming of age. So that's thinking backwards. So that's one way you could do it. So like maybe I want to say, okay, Hook. So something about, maybe how this book is relevant today, or maybe how this book is interesting, or something that this book is about. So for me, like, I think about Black Lives Matter, right? That's something that's happening right now. So I could start, remember, we always start by saying the name of the book and the name of the author. So I'm gonna say, To Kill a, whoops. Well, that's fine for now. To Kill a Mockingbird. And we either italicize or highlight titles. I like how italics look better. Looks prettier to me. So, oh, and I want to say, whoops. Here. Two is part of it, so that has to be their underlined or italicized too. So I'm going to say the novel, because that's the type of book it is. It's not a short story. It's not a poem. The novel, comma, To Kill a Mockingbird. Oops. Take off the italics. By Harper Lee, is extremely relevant today. Okay, there, that's a hook, because then you go, oh, well, that's based in the 30s. Why would it be relevant today? It was written in the 60s, but it's based in the 30s. That's old. What does that have to do with me? So you're getting the reader thinking. Remember, this essay should be valuable and informative to someone who has never read the book. That's why you give all this background. Someone who has never, ever read the book should be able to read your essay and understand something about the novel and understand something about what you learned about life from reading this novel. So that's what we call theme. So the novel To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee is extremely relevant today. It addresses, or remember, I could say it talks about racism, but I want to sound more academic. So instead of saying that, I'm going to say addresses. It addresses racism in the 1930s with the Black Lives Matters movement. We can see that this is still an issue in today's society. Okay, so there's my hook. Okay, I'm not going to underline this because that's pink, or I'll take it off. So we want to only underline our thesis pink, and usually that is the last paragraph, or no, I mean highlight our thesis pink, and that's the last sentence of the first paragraph. So I'll get to that in a bit. But here, okay, this is our hook. Okay, we gave some background, a statement of intrigue, it's relevant today, and we have background that it's based in the 1930s. Okay, so remember, we always reread to edit. The novel To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee is extremely relevant today. It addresses racism in the 1930s. With the Black Lives Matters movement, we can see that this is still an issue in today's society. So in the book, so now that we have our background and our hook, now we want to start talking about what our essay is going to be about. Okay, so we decided I want to write about Mrs. DeBow being a nasty, racist old lady. I want to write about DILL, Scout's cousin, who calls Atticus the N-word lover. He says, "N lover," and then Scout gets really mad. She doesn't even know what it means, but she gets mad and she punches him. And then she gets in trouble. Okay, so Mrs. DeBow, DILL, and then for the last one, Tom Robinson. And I can address these in a few ways. So these are all characters. So I could just talk about character if I wanted to. Or these also involve conflict. So I could talk about conflict if I want to, or I could talk about character in one, and then conflict in another one. And then maybe I could do another one about conflict too. Like I could do one about conflict and two about characters. Usually we don't do that though. We want to keep it consistent. So either I would suggest either doing all of them about one or making each one different if you can. So like maybe internal conflict, because Jem is trying to hold in his anger when Mrs. DeBow tells him like, your dad Atticus is no better than and then he says the N-word that he works for. And he has, there's external conflict, but there's internal conflict because he's keeping it in. So maybe you want to do internal conflict, external conflict, and character. So it's up to you how you want to do it. So you can either do it about 3 different ones or do them all the same. It's totally up to you. Let's see. So I want to start introducing, like giving the reader an idea of what my essay is going to be about. So I'm going to say in the book, and for me, I think I'm going to do conflict because these are all, the conflict is what stands out to me here. So for me, in this example, I'm going to talk about conflict. In the book, Lee, so since we already used the author's full name here, we only have to say the author's full name once. After that, we can only call the author their last name. So we don't have to say Harper Lee, Harper Lee, Harper Lee, Harper Lee. Then afterwards, we say it once in the beginning. And then for the rest of the essay, we call the writer Lee, because that's her last name. We don't call writers by their first name. That's kind of like disrespectful. We want to call them by their last name to show we respect this artist and their work. So in the book, Lee uses conflict to convey the theme of racism. Okay, so that's one theme. But then remember, this isn't an essay asking about racism. This is an essay asking about coming of age. So I need to connect this racism theme to coming of age. So there you have to be creative. This is where you need to make connections on your own and come up with your own connections. I think, okay, well, Jem and Scout are growing up here in Macomb, Alabama, which is mostly very racist. Their dad, Atticus, is not racist, but he gets picked on by everyone else in the community. Jem and Scout get picked on and attacked by everyone in the community because their dad believes in equality. And this is how they're growing up. So what does it mean to grow up in a racist community? How do you grow up in a racist community and not become a racist yourself? So these are questions that you have to kind of ask yourself questions. Like you have to practice what Jem and Scout practice, like putting yourself in the character's shoes to make that connection. So again, for me, what I think is, well, they have to learn. That's what they have to learn. That's their challenge. So, okay, how do I word this? So I don't know how to word it exactly, but I kind of have an idea of what I want to say. So I'm going to reread that paragraph. The novel To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee is extremely relevant today. It addresses racism in the 1930s. With the Black Lives Matter movement, we can see that this is still an issue in today's society. In the book, Lee uses conflict to convey the theme of racism. So then I'm going to talk about Scout. Or maybe I'll talk about, and I can go back and change this as I'm writing. Or maybe I'll say Scout and Jem, since maybe I'll talk, I don't know if I'll end up talking about both or one. You don't have to know everything. You can figure it out as you go. In the book, Lee uses conflict to convey the theme of racism. Scout and Jem learn how to handle conflict between their dad, Atticus, and their racist neighborhood. And I can add, and I can end it there, but it's nice to add some background information so that someone who hasn't read this book doesn't know it's in Macomb, Alabama. So I can add in their racist neighborhood in Macomb, Alabama. So you can add it there, but it's just nice to give your reader that extra information. Okay, so I'm almost there. I can see, okay, I have my background, I have my hook, and I'm getting really close to my thesis or my main message that this essay is going to be about. So let me reread. So remember, good writers always reread their work, especially if you're stuck. If you're stuck, rereading your work will make you see connections that you didn't notice as you were writing. The novel To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee is extremely relevant today. It addresses racism in the 1930s. With the Black Lives Matter movement, we can see that this is still an issue in today's society. In the book, Lee uses conflict to convey the theme of racism. Scout and Jem learn how to handle conflict between their dad, Atticus, and their racist neighborhood in Macomb, Alabama. And then remember at the end of the chapter, we talked about how So this is where it's helpful to think about the last chapter and all those messages that the writer was giving us. How she said, the last thing Atticus says, or Scout says when she's falling asleep, he was real nice, Atticus. He hadn't done any of those things. And she might be talking about a character in the book, but we know that it's a reference to Boo Radley, how he's nice, even though people say mean things about him. And he says, most people are, Scout, when you finally see them. So showing like everyone, even Mrs. DeBow, even Mr. Cunningham, even DILL, everyone has like a little bit of good. Everyone has something good we can learn from them. So for me, when they realize that there's good in everyone, because even Hitler, who's like one of the most hated humans in history, Atticus tells her it's not okay to hate anyone, not even Hitler. So for us, that's like, what? Like it can be like a crazy thing to say. Like, what does he mean, don't hate Hitler? But I think what he's saying is like, don't let hate poison your heart, because that's probably how Hitler became Hitler. That's probably how Mrs. DeBow became Mrs. DeBow. She probably became a mean, nasty old lady because she had so much hate in her heart. You know, Hitler probably committed genocide and killed so many people because he had so much hatred in his heart. Or the Cunninghams, when at first they want to go kill Tom Robinson, they do that because they have so much hatred in their heart. So I think that's what Atticus is, or what Harper Lee is telling us through Atticus. Fight for what's right. Stand up for what's right. Think for yourself. Be brave. But while you're doing that, don't let hate poison your heart, because then you're going to become just like the people committing injustice who you're angry about. So that's what I think when I read that last chapter with all of those messages about loving others and seeing things in someone else's point of view. So let's see, how can we word this? Okay, so in the book, Lee uses conflict to convey the theme of racism. Scout and Jem learn how to handle conflict between their dad, Atticus, and their racist neighbor in Macomb, Alabama. When Scout and Jem learn to be compassionate of others, so remember, like, they learn how to put themselves in someone else's shoes. They show maturity and coming of age. Okay, so that's it. I finally connected those things that I noticed to coming of age. Oof, that was tough. It takes a lot of thinking. It takes a lot of creativity. People think essays are boring, but they actually require a lot of creative thinking. So, okay, this whole thing, so we only need to highlight our thesis pink. This whole thing is not our thesis. The thesis, we should try to make one sentence if we can. I mean, this is a thesis, so I can take all of this off. When Scout learned to be compassionate of others, they show maturity and coming of age. This is kind of part of the thesis too, though, because I'm explaining how conflict is the literary element we're gonna talk about. So I think it would be appropriate to highlight both of these here. So usually good writing, we want to try to make it, we want to make our thesis one sentence, but if we need to, that's okay, that's fine. Okay, so now we have our thesis, and honestly, you guys, this is the hardest part. Making your thesis and your conclusion that ties everything together, that is the hardest part of writing an essay. If you do that, then the rest of it becomes kind of easy, okay? So you're gonna put in your paragraphs and you're gonna edit it. So maybe I have Mrs. DeBow is mean and she Or here, let me think of something you guys might have written. So you guys have your literary analysis chart, right? And this was your sentence starter. So maybe you started with something like this. And this one, if you're gonna write about Mrs. DeBow, you can use your CFA paragraph from chapter 11. Okay, so Mrs. DeBow, I remember, was in chapter 11. And then here, you put in the author's name, Lee. So remember, we already said Harper Lee here. Now for the rest of the essay, we just say the last name. In chapter 11, Lee uses, and then for all of these, I decided I'm gonna talk about conflict. And you know what, I think that would be a good idea to do. Maybe like highlight your literary elements if you're gonna do 1 or 2 or 3. And highlight your theme. So I kind of have 2 here. I have racism and coming of age. So that's okay. I can combine both. Okay, so I'm gonna say in chapter 11, Lee uses conflict to convey the idea of racism. And then I say Mrs. DeBow is mean, and she harasses is a mean. And again, so I might say mean when I'm talking in class, but since we're writing an essay, we're presenting our ideas in a formal way, I want to try to use more academic language. Say, okay, mean is kind of informal. I think cruel sounds a little bit more academic. So I could say Mrs. DeBow is a cruel old woman who harasses whoops. Okay, so Lee uses conflict to convey the idea of racism. Mrs. DeBow is a cruel old woman who harasses Jem and Scout every day on their way to town. Okay, so, and then I might have a quote like when she says, your father is no better than the, and then she says a bad word. I don't feel comfortable saying it, but I'm gonna write it in there because it's a text from the book. So let's see, so we're in chapter 10. So okay, that was chapter 11. So I'm gonna look for that quote. I don't remember exactly where it was, but I remember it's in this chapter, so I can kind of search for it here. Don't you say hey to me, you ugly girl. She's so mean. What else does she say? Oh, here it is. Okay, she says this is the one that makes Jem mad. He's Scarlet, so Scarlet is red. Like he's red because he's so mad. Because she says your father's no better than the N-word she works for. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and put it here. Your father. Wait. How was it? Okay, your father's no better than the and trash he works for. Okay, so maybe I have something like that. Maybe right now my paragraph looks like this. In chapter 11, Lee uses conflict to convey the idea of racism. Mrs. DeBow is a cruel old woman who harasses Jem and Scout every day on their way to town. Your father's no better than the N-words and trash he works for. Okay, so that's a good start. If you have that, that's okay. It's 3 sentences, you have the quote, you have your topic sentence, but it is not enough to be a fully developed body paragraph in your essay. It's a start, but it's not done. So something that's gonna help you figure out what you need to add is highlighting the way it shows here. Okay, so let me see what I'm missing. So I have the topic sentence claim, that's the first sentence. Okay, yeah, that's a good topic sentence. I have the chapter, I have the author's name, I have the literary element, and I have a theme. Okay, Great. So let me highlight that pink because that's what I'm highlighting my topic sentences. Okay, next I should have a transition word or phrase. Do I have a transition word or phrase? So transition words, that's like for example, or for instance, or to illustrate, anything like that to connect this to my idea. So I don't have anything like that, so I need to add that. Okay, in chapter 11, Lee uses conflict to convey the idea of racism. For example, Mrs. DeBow is a cruel old woman who harasses Jem and Scout every day on their way to town. Okay, yeah, harasses, that is an idea of conflict. Okay, so it is a good connection to my topic sentence because harassment is a type of conflict. It's an external conflict because someone is, trying to assault you and hurt you. They're attacking you. Okay, so now I have my transition sentence. That already sounds so much better. It sounds so much more academic. Okay, for example, Mrs. DeBow is a cruel old woman who harasses Jem and Scout every day on their way to town. And then a lead in. So that's like where I'm getting ready, like I'm warming the reader up to explain the quote. Because if I just see this quote and I have no idea what's going on, then that's not gonna be informative to me. So I need a lead in. So it could be like a little bit more context, like what's going on, or maybe developing that theme of racism more. So for example, Mrs. DeBow is a cruel old woman, harasses Scout and Jem every day on their way to town. Scout or Jem is mad when Mrs. DeBow insults his father. Okay, and then again, mad, that's like a kind of informal word. So I'm gonna think, I can look up in my thesaurus. Okay, what's another word for mad? Okay, thesaurus. What's a better word for mad? Okay, mad. Let's look up some synonyms. Or I can even look up synonym, mad. Let's see what comes up. Angry, furious, fuming, enraged, incensed. So this one insane, no, not really insane. I think this one more angry. This is what wrathful. So I like enraged. I'm gonna use that one. That's a strong sounding word. So Jem is enraged. Okay. So let me go back. Jem is enraged when Mrs. DeBow insults his father. And then here, so there's lots of different fancy ways to introduce quotes, but for right now, if you're not totally comfortable with that, just start by saying who said it. Mrs. DeBow says, comma, and if that's where you're at, that's okay. If you want to add on to that, you can, but this is perfectly fine. Whatever you do, do not leave it, oops, do not leave it how it, don't leave it with just a floating quote by itself, okay? We don't really do that when we write essays because it just kind of looks weird, it stands out, it's not good formal writing. So insults his father. Your father's no better than the N and trash he works for. Okay, so that doesn't look good by itself. You never want to do that in an essay. So at least minimum say who said it. Mrs. DeBow says, comma, and then the quote, and then the page number. I'm gonna have to go back and look for it later. So for now, I'll just put page, or I'll do this to remind myself. Okay, I have to go back and find it. And then the period, so it seems like it should be period, but since we have an exclamation mark here, we just move it outside of the parentheses there. Okay, like that. Your father's no better than the N and trash he works for. Okay, so now I have my quote. This is my lead-in. So my lead-in is what builds up to the quote and gives some background or develops the theme. Jem is enraged when Mrs. DeBow insults his father. If I wanted to add to it, I could say with racist remarks. And now that connects to my theme a little bit more. And it connects to my topic sentence a little more. You don't have to, but it's just things you can do to help make your ideas more clear. And then finally, I have some commentary and my concluding sentence. Okay, so commentary, explaining what this shows. Okay, so I need to remember, okay, I'm talking about coming of age. So this is where you need to come back to the big picture. We want to talk about coming of age, okay? So let me reread this to think about how this shows Jem coming of age. In chapter 11, Lee uses conflict to convey the idea of racism. For example, Mrs. Oh, I forgot a period there. That's another good reason to reread, to find those little mistakes. For example, Mrs. DeBow is a cruel old woman who harasses Jem and Scout every day on their way to town. Jem is enraged when Mrs. DeBow insults his father with racist remarks. Mrs. DeBow says, "Your father is no better than the N and trash he works for." And then I might say what Jem does after. Jem reacts by tearing up Mrs. DeBow's camellias. Did I spell that right? Let me check. I'm not sure if I spelled that right. Camellias. Oops. Yeah, camellia. Oh, but it's not a proper noun, not capitalized. Okay. So let's make that lowercase. And then they belong to Mrs. DeBow, so I need an apostrophe S. Your father is no better than the N and trash he works for. Jem reacts by tearing up Mrs. DeBow's camellias. Okay, I'm gonna change this because the font looks weird and we want to keep it consistent. So this is the font we're using here. Okay. And then I can say, by the end of this chapter, Jem learns that Mrs. DeBow was in extreme pain because she was addicted to morphine. So a lot of you guys noticed that she was a drug addict and she was withdrawing. And sometimes when people are in a lot of pain and they're withdrawing, they get really mean and nasty because they're, you know, kind of like when you're sick, you're in a bad mood. Imagine that, but like pain that's unbearable. Okay, so how does this show Jem's coming of age? So she started out racist. He finds out she was in extreme pain. So I can say, by the end of this chapter, Jem learns that Mrs. DeBow was in extreme pain because she was addicted to morphine. So you can take this lots of different directions, but for me, since I think what this book is trying to say is how we should see the good in everyone, I'm going to say that Jem saw the good in Mrs. DeBow. Okay, so Jem learns courage from Mrs. DeBow. Even though she was in pain, she wanted to die free of drugs. This helps Jem come of age because, okay, so here, this is where I'm hitting my thesis. I want to go back to my thesis, coming of age and compassion. Okay, so I'm not sure how to end it, so I'm going to reread one more time and then finish this paragraph. Okay, in chapter 11, Lee uses conflict to convey the idea of racism. For example, Mrs. DeBow is a cruel old woman who harasses Jem and Scout every day on their way to town. Jem is enraged when Mrs. DeBow insults his father with racist remarks. Mrs. DeBow says, "Your father's no better than the N and trash he works for." Jem reacts by tearing up Mrs. DeBow's camellias or her flowers. By the end of this chapter, Jem learns that Mrs. DeBow was in extreme pain because she was addicted to morphine. Jem learns courage from Mrs. DeBow. Even though she was in pain, she wanted to die free of drugs. This helps Jem come of age because he realizes that there is something good to learn from everyone, even if you don't like them. So that's something that, you know, makes you more mature and makes you interact with people in a more mature way. Okay, so that looks good. So let's see, I have my commentaries. How many sentences was my commentary? Okay, let's see. So all of this is my commentary. That should be the longest part of your paragraph, because that's where you're saying your own idea. And we want to see your own ideas. Okay, so all of that is commentary. Let's see, how many sentences? 1, 2, 3, 4 sentences. Wow, so you guys might do 4 sentences. Some of you are going to do more, some of you are going to do less. But usually this is the longest part of your paragraph because it's where you're expressing your own original ideas. Because that's what people want to read. What do you think? If they want to know what's in the book, then they'll just go read the book. But how do you see the book differently? Remember, no 2 people read a book the exact same way. Okay, and then finally, I need a transition or concluding sentence. I really like transitions because they give you a clue of what's going to come up next. So, okay, I remember I want to talk about DILL in my next paragraph. So I'm going to say, we also see, wait, let me take this off because this isn't commentary anymore. This is transition. We also see this conflict emerge with Scout's cousin, DILL. Okay, so there I'm just like giving the reader a little taste of what's gonna happen next. Or if you want, like this is kind of a concluding sentence too. If you wanted to just end it here, that's a concluding sentence too. So this sentence is kind of special because you're tying it back. It's part of the commentary, but you're also tying it back to the theme. So if I ended it there, it would still be a really good paragraph because it is concluding it and tying it all together and connecting it to the coming of age. So here I have coming of age, and then up here, coming of age in my thesis. But it's good to give your reader just a little taste of what's going to happen in the next paragraph. And then here, so that is how you do a body paragraph. And then here you're going to do the same thing here in body paragraph 2. But now it's going to be about DILL, and you're going to choose a quote about DILL. And then you're going to, but I mean, for me, in my example, you're going to use your own example. And then here, maybe I'll do one about Tom Robinson. And it's going to have a quote from that chapter where they try to kill Tom Robinson. Okay? And then finally, with the conclusion, you're going to bring it all together to remind the reader, okay, so I'm telling you all about these things that happen in the book and how they show racism and coming of age and compassion. But why does this matter? What does this tell us about life? Why should we spend our time reading this? So then you can think about some of the things you said in that first paragraph. Like, okay, I talked about Black Lives Matter. I talked about how racism is still a topic today, and how coming of age and growing up and maturing means being compassionate of others. And for me, I think that idea of like not letting hate poison your heart, that's something that I really want to write about. So I might say that here. Okay, so I'm going to say my thesis again. So I might say something like, in conclusion, or in summary, or in short. I like in conclusion. You can never go wrong with in conclusion. In conclusion, Scout and Jem come of age because they learn to reject hatred. Or Yeah, so it's bringing together that idea of coming of age and that idea of racism and not letting hate poison your heart. And then a literal statement. So what actually happens? So what happens is they experience conflict with Mrs. DeBow, DILL. Oh, I've been saying the wrong kid's name. DILL is a friend. I'm sorry. No, what was that annoying kid's name? What was his name? It's not DILL. The cousin, the really annoying one who we don't like. Aunt Alexandra's nephew. DILL is their friend. See? So it's a good thing to remember. So that's why it's good to keep notes too, because then we can remember what people's names are. Who's a kid she punches who's really annoying? I think it was in a previous chapter. I think it was before chapter 11. But his name was Francis. Ah, Francis. Okay. Yes, Francis was so annoying. We don't like him. We like Dill. Dill is sensitive. Dill, and that's in chapter 9. Okay, so I'm going to use, not Dill, sorry. Francis. Dill wouldn't make sense because he never fights with them about racism. I mean, they kind of play, but they don't really fight. And that was in chapter 9, did I say? So I'm gonna just put that in here for myself to remember. In chapter 9, Lee uses conflict to convey the idea of racism. And then, so I don't say the same thing, I can say in chapter 9, Lee also uses conflict. So you don't want to say the exact same topic sentence. And maybe you can elaborate. Instead of ending the sentence there, you can say, when Francis insults Atticus. So first we had Jem getting mad because Mrs. DeBow insults Atticus, and now we have Scout getting mad because Francis, the cousin, insults Atticus. Okay, so maybe I want to talk about that one for this paragraph. So, but the point is I'm summarizing each of my paragraphs. So paragraph 1, I talked about DeBow. Paragraph 2, I talked about Francis. Paragraph 3, I talked about the Cunninghams and how they wanted to lynch Tom Robinson. They experienced conflict with Mrs. DeBow, Francis, and the Cunninghams. Okay, so that's literally what happens. So that's green. And now we have an interpretation. So how can I interpret this? However, even though they experience hatred, they do not let themselves become evil or mean or cruel or hateful or bitter. So I can use some kind of word. Okay, and then however, I love that word. It's just like but, except you can't start a sentence with but. You can start a new sentence with however. So it's kind of like but. Okay, in conclusion, Scout and Jem come of age because they learn to reject hatred. They experience conflict with Mrs. DeBow, Francis, and the Cunninghams, but even though they experience hatred, they never let themselves become evil or bitter. Okay, and then, so here, normally when I'm talking, I would say but since this is an essay and we want to use complete sentences, I need to use however. Even though they experience hatred, they do not let themselves become evil or bitter. Interpretive. And then universal. So how do I bring that? So I want to bring that back to the coming of age. So they show maturity and coming of age by learning right from wrong and so I really like that idea of not letting evil poison their hearts. Not letting evil or hatred poison their hearts. Okay, because a lot of times when a bad thing happens to you, it's normal where you get kind of mean, you can get kind of bitter. We've all been through it, even if it's for a little while. I've been through it. Sometimes you're not yourself when you're going through something, but you know that you're really healing from it when you're able to let that go and still be yourself. So I think that's how they show maturity and coming of age. Okay, so let's read this. In conclusion, Jem and Scout come of age because they learn to reject hatred. They experience a conflict with Mrs. DeBow, Francis, and the Cunninghams. However, even though they experience hatred, they do not let themselves become evil or bitter. They show maturity and coming of age by learning right from wrong and not letting hatred poison their hearts. Sounds good? Ties it all together. So I'm gonna color code them. You guys need to color code all of these things too and your outline. And if you guys do this really well, if you guys do a good job for your essay, all you're gonna do is copy and paste these and put it in MLA format, and you're gonna be good. You're gonna be golden. But let's see, what were we gonna do? We're gonna color code these. Okay, so this is a thesis. We're gonna make it pink. And then literally what happens, they experience conflict with Mrs. DeBow, Francis, and the Cunninghams. So I'm talking about the 3 paragraphs that I wrote about. I'm reminding the reader, hey, this is what we talked about in my essay. Okay, that's green. Oh no, I always do that. I change the font color instead of the highlighter. Okay. However, even though they experience hatred, they do not become evil or bitter. So that's my interpretation of those events. So that's interpretive. Okay. Interpretive. And then the universal statement. They show maturity and coming of age by learning right from wrong and not letting hatred poison their hearts. So that's still kind of more interpretive. This one is a universal. But I want to have something strong. So maybe I'll say another universe, or I could either break this into 2 sentences. Like say they show maturity and coming of age by learning right from wrong and developing compassion. And then we could say from this book, readers learn readers learn that we shouldn't let hatred poison their hearts. So now that's a universal statement, like that's something you could put on a fortune cookie that anybody could see. And even if they've never read this book, they would still have some kind of valuable lesson that they can apply to their lives. Okay, you guys, so hopefully that helps. So you have an example of a thesis, an example of a conclusion, and you have an example of a body paragraph. So usually I let you use my examples, but for this, since it's the final for the year, please use your own examples. You can use these as sentence frames, you can use these as an idea, but put it in your own words, okay? So good luck, you guys. Do your best, and hopefully this helps. Let me know if you have any questions about anything that you heard in this video, or if there's any other questions that come up that I didn't answer. So thanks for listening. Bye.